I've been a deep-sea diver for 12 years. After what I discovered, I'm quitting my job for good. I've seen a lot of upsetting and even unexplainable things in my time, but nothing compares to what I found in my last dive. I don't think I'll ever go near the ocean again. I've considered quitting many times in my career. Most people quit after their first recovery. Being a search and rescue diver, we are trained to find and save people before they drown. Sometimes we save them, sometimes we're just too late, but sometimes what we find is so much worse. I got the call around 11 a.m. A father had taken his 10-year-old son fly fishing. At one point, the father managed to stab a hook all the way through his finger. He went back up to his truck to get a first aid kit. The boy was gone when he returned a few minutes later. When I first heard the story, I hung my head in silence for a moment. It had been raining heavily for almost a month now, and the waters were running faster than ever. To make things worse, it was unusually cold for the season. A number of people had gone missing in recent weeks. Many of them had yet to be found. I had little hope of finding the boy alive. Me and a couple of other divers were at the site where the boy went missing within an hour, and a larger search and rescue team located a few towns over was headed our way. We talked with the father and even searched the forest for a bit, hoping that he had just wandered off, but eventually we realized that we would have to begin searching in the river. It wasn't a new feat for us to have to dive in somewhere other than the ocean. People frequently go missing in waterways that connect to the ocean. The moment I got in the water, I knew the boy was gone. The current was worse than it had ever been, and even I had difficulty navigating the icy river. We looked for hours in the surrounding areas and even expanded our search once the larger team had arrived. The boy was nowhere to be found. I was surprised. I hadn't expected to find him alive, but I had at least anticipated finding a body. However, there was no trace of him. The sun got low and the air grew colder. We were considering calling it off as nightfall approached and resuming the search the next day when I discovered something. There's a lot of creek beds around the river. Many of them have dried up as a result of encroaching vegetation or man-made efforts to divert the water. We usually don't pay any attention to them. However, with all of the recent rain, I noticed that one of the larger creek beds had begun flowing again. A surprising amount of water crashed through it, easily enough to carry a young boy. The creek ran directly across a bend in the river, connecting it at 2 points. I followed it and realized that the boy could be located outside of our initial search area. As I approached where the creek reconnected with the main river, I felt a sinking feeling in my gut. There's a place in the river where not even search and rescue divers are supposed to go. It's known as Badwater. This area lies on one half of the river and runs for about 100 yards. It's near a densely vegetated area, so we don't often have to worry about people swimming there. But a lot of disappearances occur in the surrounding waters. Despite that, I've been warned not to dive there since I began doing search and rescue. Supposedly the undercurrent is so strong that even the most experienced swimmer would be swept away in an instant. Don't go near Badwater. It was a mantra of the older divers. The creek ended exactly in the center of the Badwater region. As I reached it, I stopped and chewed my lip thoughtfully. If I went back and reported this to the other divers, they would tell me to let it go. They wouldn't let me dive there. But deep down, I felt like the boy's body must be tangled up in some weeds nearby. If only I could find it. I hated the idea of that kid being stuck down there, slowly bloating and rotting away while his parents sat at home wondering where their boy had gone. Badwater didn't seem to be that bad. I'd seen rougher waters before, but I knew looks could be deceiving. Just below the surface it could be flowing faster than I ever imagined, and I'd be swept away in an instant. Besides, I wasn't supposed to dive alone. I almost turned back, but something made me stay. I stared into the river for a moment, thinking about the boy. Then I put on my gear and dropped into the icy waters. The first thing I noticed was that the current actually seemed pretty weak. As a matter of fact, it was weaker than the rest of the river. The water was extremely deep there, and I could see only blackness below as I dove. I kicked deeper and deeper, thinking that the current might pick up lower down, but the opposite seemed to be true. The water was almost completely still. I went even deeper, until finally green shapes began to materialize in front of me. I thought I'd finally reached a bed of weeds, but as I kicked lower, the truth came into full view. I felt vomit come up at the sight, an odd and dangerous sensation when you're wearing a scuba mask. Countless arms stuck up from the ground below. I thought I had come upon a trove of bodies, but the disgusting reality became even more apparent only a moment later. The arms grew directly into the ground. They even had roots that spread out from the base. It was as if someone had cut off hundreds of arms at the shoulder and planted them there. They were green, and I watched as they clutched at the water around them. They varied in size and seemingly age. Grotesque baby hands sprouted near the bottom, and they opened and closed their fists hungrily. It was then that I saw the boy. His eyes stared sightlessly ahead as those grotesque arms pulled his dead body downward. It seemed they had just gotten a hold of him. The arms yanked at him, burying him in the surrounding sediment. They pushed and writhed and squirmed until he was securely buried up to the chest. I stared in mesmerized horror. That was when the other bodies came into focus. There must have been at least 4 more, all in varying stages of decay. Some were bloated beyond recognition, only bulky white masses that protruded loosely from the riverbed. I once again felt vomit rising in my throat and swallowed it back down. The hands were feeding off the bodies, using them as fertilizer. The moment I clambered out of the water, I tore my mask off and retched. I couldn't stop thinking about those disgusting bodies, those grasping hands. They were like some sort of carnivorous plant, yet they were so humanoid. I vomited again at the thought. I frantically ran back to our base camp and pulled one of the other divers aside. Moose was the most experienced person on our team. He'd been diving for over 20 years ever since moving here. I told him about what I saw. When I finished, he stared at me in cold silence. I told you never to go near Badwater. His voice contained an iciness that even his thick Louisiana accent couldn't conceal. That's what you're concerned about? I was incredulous. He placed a hand on my shoulder and squeezed tightly. Don't tell anyone else about this. If the others find out you went into Badwater. He trailed off and thought for a moment. Well, it won't be good. He shook his head like a disappointed father. But what about those things? I tried to keep my voice down, hoping no one would hear us. How many people have died because of those damn things? Shut up, Moose said. We have an agreement. There's a reason they only grow in Badwater. Don't mess this up. I started to say something, but the words caught in my throat. He was keeping something from me. He sighed and I saw something like sadness behind his eyes. Sometimes you have to decide between lesser and greater evils. Even the best possible decisions can still keep you up at night. He went silent for a moment and only stared at me. Don't tell anyone about this. Maybe one day you'll understand. He walked away after that and called off the day's search. Despite what I told him, we continued to search for the next 2 days. By the third day, we called it off completely and gave our condolences to the family. The search was called off, but I couldn't let it go. That night, I went back to Badwater alone. I took my equipment and drove over there. I had to see those horrible plant-like arms again. I had to know they were real. As soon as I got there, I threw on my scuba gear and dove into the darkness. I dove into the icy blackness, kicking deeper and deeper. I swam past the typical small fish or seagrass until I reached the riverbed. But this time, there was nothing. No grasping green arms, no buried bodies, just empty mud and darkness. Was I in the wrong spot? No, I was sure of it. I surfaced, gasping for air. As I swam for shore, I felt something brush my leg. I jerked away, heart pounding, and turned to look. Nothing. It must have been the seagrass. Then I felt a sharp set of claws dig into my leg. I screamed out in pain, muffled by the cover on my face. I kicked and tried to swing at the claws, but it was no use. They were digging deeper into my skin. A pale arm reached up from the depths below, its long, skinny fingers brushing my flipper. I felt another set snatch onto my forearm. It was taking my arm. I screamed and swam faster, and the claws fell out of my skin. I finally stumbling onto the shore. There were rips in my wetsuit. Blood was seeping from my skin. What the hell was that? I turned back to the water, shaking. The river was calm and still, no sign of the nightmarish arm. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? Just as I stood to leave, I heard Moose's voice behind me, cold as ice. I told you not to come back here.